Hello everyone, my name's Dr. Andrew Booth. I'm one of the Cochrane co-conveners of the Qualitative and Implementation Methods Group, and today I'm going to be speaking about review protocols for qualitative evidence syntheses. And this material accompanies general material on producing a review protocol for a systematic review. So as with any review protocol, we're thinking of a protocol as specifying the plan by which the review will go through the 3 stages of identifying, appraising and collating the evidence. And so what we're doing is producing a written document that contains background information about the problem and its importance, a specification of the problem using a format such as SPICE or PICO, and the methodology of the review on how we're going to conduct it. And it's helpful to think of this in terms of being like the recipe for a review. If you think about a literal recipe, we have the ingredients, so the types of studies that we've got, the quantities of those ingredients, so some of the features that they're likely to have, the methods that we're actually going to follow in order to go from the raw ingredients to the final product, and any tools that we need, any equipment. For example, naming of specific quality checklists, or whether we're going to be using the grade ScHARR methods for assessing confidence around review findings. And if we're cooking in a team, then usually we can use the recipe to apportion tasks, and that's equally true in the context of a systematic review. And if we think about a qualitative evidence synthesis protocol specifically, then one of the characteristics is engagement with the stakeholders who will help to identify what they consider important as a line of inquiry. We should present an argument for the importance of the review and its relevance, as we would do for a quantitative protocol. We should describe the amount and type of relevant research potentially available, not in absolute numbers because we haven't reached that point yet, but in terms of whether studies are plentiful or relatively rare. And this might impact on, for example, whether we decide to use survey data to corroborate the findings from a limited number of qualitative studies, or whether we think there are sufficient quality studies not to resort to supporting survey data. The QES protocol should also present a review question that has come out of the line of argument that we've presented in the background, and typically it would also start to explore how and why the intervention works, so that we might record, for example, a preliminary theoretical framework or a logic model as a starting point. Now, obviously, the extent to which we can finalize that will depend on the amount of prior thinking that has taken place, both by ourselves and by previous authors, and it will also open up the possibility that we might refine or develop this theoretical framework or logic model throughout the course of our review. So this isn't a compulsory element, but it is very useful where available. We would also describe the methods that we're going to use for identifying the studies, and whether we're going to be engaging in knowledge building or theory generating reviews. And this is closely linked to our choice of synthesis. The retreat framework requires that we think about the purpose of our review, and that narrows down our choice of methods. And that we will also describe our methods for data extraction with a clear idea of the sort of data, whether it's likely to be descriptive data or richer, more analytical data. The main components for a qualitative synthesis protocol are very similar to those for any review protocol. So the introduction will include both the background information and the objectives, giving an indication of the scope and the primary and secondary research questions. We expect to see a search strategy, how we're going to do study selection, how we're going to do data extraction, both the procedure and the checklist that we're going to use to assess study quality, or risk to rigor, as we might prefer to call it, as an alternative to the risk of bias that is used in the quantitative world, our procedures for synthesis, how we're going to disseminate the final review, and a project timetable. And it's important to bear in mind that whereas two people are often used in quantitative reviews to corroborate and reach consensus, that two people in a qualitative synthesis, particularly when it comes to the synthesis and interpretation, may be used to provide a diversity of views. And this distinction between perhaps using two people early on for study selection, which follows the model of a quantitative review, and using two people for synthesis, which aims for divergence, is a very important thing to think about and to register in your protocol. There is only one reporting format for protocols, regardless of whether they are quantitative or qualitative. So PRISMA-P aims to facilitate the development of any systematic review protocols. It involves three main elements: a checklist, which is probably the most frequently used part, and some of the items on that checklist may not appear directly relevant to qualitative synthesis, and you will have to think of an equivalent. But then there is a statement paper outlining the requirements and why they've been chosen, and then an explanation and elaboration paper to actually help in the implementation of the reporting standards. Very often in pragmatic reviews, we're required to produce a timetable and a plan for dissemination. This isn't a formal requirement in the PRISMA-P checklist, but as many of us are writing our protocol, perhaps for research funding or as a student assignment, it's very important to think about the stages and how long that they will take. So we would specify dates for report delivery, other important deadlines, both internal and external. We will need to give some consideration to how long each step will take. For example, calculating how long it will take us to quality assess each article, or how many titles and abstracts we might be able to sift within an hour period. It would include a dissemination plan, including plans for social media and websites. And in our book, Systematic Approaches to a Successful Literature Review, for which I was the first author, we provide some sample timetables. So QES review protocols generally follow a similar format to effectiveness review protocols, except that the review question is more likely to be framed using a framework like SPICE or SPIDER, or perhaps the new Perspective format. And it may well be that part of the protocol involves finalizing some of those elements, whereas with a quantitative review, it would be quite unusual to still have elements of the question formulation unresolved. The sampling strategy is another area of a QES review protocol that requires more thought. The default for most systematic reviews is a comprehensive search strategy, but if what we're trying to do is more about enlightenment, then we might choose to sample extreme cases. We might sample across different characteristics that we think may result in different opinions. So we might sample from studies in older populations and younger populations, high-income country and low-income countries. So we might aim for diversity rather than the homogeneity that the reviews of quantitative research often aim for. It does require that we define what sort of data is going to be included. So are we going to only include verbatim extracts from the study participants? Are we going to include those extracts plus observations by the authors, so on the significance of that data, and are we going to include non-qualitative research sources like surveys, so we're including qualitative data, not just qualitative studies, or indeed are we going to other qualitative sources like, for example, web pages, bulletin boards, etc. And where it comes to the choice of synthesis method, this is very dependent on the available data, such things as the richness of the studies, the thickness of the contextual detail, and the data type. And if we think about, by contrast, a systematic review of effectiveness, then the decision is usually about whether or not meta-analysis will be possible or not, and if it is possible, whether our model is a fixed effects or a random effects model, whereas the choice of syntheses methods for qualitative reviews is a much more a wider choice and will require more time. Another feature that might be different for a qualitative synthesis protocol is the fact that it's iterative, and this is from the guidance by Harris and colleagues, that the Cochrane guidance, which shows that there will be iteration as we seek to resolve these different elements, like framing the problem and then reframing it, developing lines of inquiry and then having follow-up lines of inquiry, having broad questions that are subsequently refined, a broader search strategy narrowed down to specific considerations, and a mapping to look at the quantity and quality of the evidence, followed by a sort of something that's more akin to a coding process of mapping. If we look at published protocols, then we can see some of the differences. They stand out at you. So we see, for example, that the focus of the review question is on such things as experiences, perceptions, and these could be of three main parties, of patients, of carers, and of health professionals. That very often this is framed in terms of barriers and facilitators. We prefer the term factors, but it's very common to see that purpose. And we might also be interested in gaps or differences in perceptions between groups. So, for example, how patients' views differ from their carers, or how carers' views differ from health professionals. In terms of sampling, we would sample for diversity rather than for similarity. So we might, for example, pick databases from particular disciplines to represent a divergent or different view. We might also sample from different geographical regions to ensure, again, diversity. We might sample from subject specialist databases as well as from general social science databases like Scopus and Web of Knowledge. We might also use the cluster approach to searching, which involves finding some key reports as a starting point and then looking for articles that are connected either through citations, through related articles. And this is often the case where the terminology of qualitative research is less clear. And some of the specific requirements that we would notice in a protocol for QES, we might see the mention of specific qualitative software. We might see the names of particular checklists that are less familiar than the risk of bias tools in the quantitative world. We may see a reference to particular methodologies, such as the source book for metaethnography here, and we'll see differently named reporting standards. So perhaps in TREC being used rather than the general PRISMA reporting standard. One of the very useful resources that's now available has been produced by the Cochrane Epoch group. They've produced a template that it combines the functions of a qualitative evidence synthesis protocol and the synthesis itself. And this template links to guidance from the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods group, steering the unfamiliar author through the different choices. And so, for example, it prompts on the need for reflexivity amongst the author team. QES protocols do have challenges, but also have strategies by which we can resolve them. It may not be clear from the beginning what our choice of synthesis method is going to be, and we resolve that by going through a scoping process, but also by offering alternatives, perhaps keeping it open and saying, if, for example, the data is sufficiently rich, we will engage in a metaethnography, and if it is thinner and less open to sustaining theoretical thought, we might go instead for a thematic synthesis. So we might actually name both of those in the protocol as alternatives. Also, subgroups may not always be pre-specified. We may only start to see differences between populations as we start to look at the data. So, for example, our review might be combining children and adolescents, and yet we end up by seeing that actually adolescents have sort of attach more importance to self-esteem, and so they are responsive to different types of interventions than from children. And by their nature, qualitative questions are about exploration and discovery, and so we need to build in flexibility in our protocol from the start to allow that process of discovery as we go through the review. And as with quantitative protocols, actually writing the protocol can be a tedious process. We've facetiously suggested here that you find someone else to write the protocol for you, but seriously, it's important that the main people involved are the ones who write the protocol so that they're very familiar with the process. What we can do is we can look at existing protocols to help us in the process, make sure we don't miss anything out, and we can also involve many team members in peer reviewing the protocols so that we can be sure of its quality. As with quantitative protocols, it's important to bear in mind the need for registration. This serves several purposes. Although we don't fully understand bias in the context of qualitative synthesis, we are starting to look at ways of preventing the authors from imposing their subjective opinion. So this would include such mechanisms as reflexivity, that we are seeing QES becoming much more plentiful, and so increasingly we're seeing overviews of qualitative syntheses, and if qualitative syntheses are currently in progress, then we certainly don't want to risk duplicating them. And finally, the need for registration is determined by the fact that when we want to publish, we will have to be able to submit details of the protocol and how it's been registered. And where the outcomes relate specifically to health, either a condition or to an intervention, then we register our protocols as we would do for quantitative health protocols on the Prospero registry. And this is a way of staking our claim. It provides an audit trail of any amendments. It's important to bear in mind that it's only been checked for sense, not for and for completeness, not for scientific integrity, but nevertheless it represents a useful window on plans. So in summary then, a protocol is a recipe. It helps us with the quality control of the product. It doesn't guarantee the product, just as a recipe doesn't guarantee a successful bake. It's useful for internal communication, particularly where we have a large team or where a student is communicating with their supervisor. But it's also, as we said, a way of staking a claim to prevent duplication and to be a first stab really at communicating the existence of our research, ready to build on that when the review becomes available later down the line. We've seen that modifications should only be made with good reasons for doing so, but a qualitative synthesis needs to have some flexibility so that modifications that are possibilities from the start are clearly signposted as options. And prospective registration fits in with the whole idea of good science and eliminating research waste, and it prevents against protects against a number of threats to scientific integrity. So here are some of the references that would help. There is only one specific article on writing a qualitative systematic review protocol. The Cochrane guidance by Harris is signalled, and when it comes to the choice of synthesis, then the middle article there from the Integrate project helps in guiding that choice. So thank you for your attention. I hope you now feel equipped to be able to sit down and either yourself or with colleagues and a supervisor write your protocol. And here's wishing you a successful qualitative review.